Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the July gardening checklist video. I've done one of these each month this year, and I will continue to do them the rest of the year. July, of course, can be pretty hot for a lot of people, and probably a lot of people probably aren't going to want to be out in the yard doing a lot of installation during the middle of summer, but that doesn't mean they're not gardening to-dos. And quite a few really that you probably should be keeping an eye out for during the month of July. So let's get started on pruning. What pruning can we be doing during the month? You can still probably get away with doing rejuvenative pruning, like if you needed to take older shrubs way back. I'd probably get that done by the middle of July. That we're definitely on the clock at this point. We don't want to do that too late in the summer. Otherwise, that new growth coming back out on them has the potential to be damaged going into winter. So like I say, we are on the clock for that. I'm probably not going to do any pruning on any of my flowering shrubs at this point. Things like azaleas have already started to set flower buds. There's a lot of plants that have that next year's flowers are already in the process of being set, so be super careful with those things. The shrubs that are still flowering, things like hydrangeas, you can deadhead, take off the old spent flowers. Some people like to let them dry on the plant or will cut them to dry, but if you're not interested in having them be dry on the plant, go ahead and cut them off, and that will put some energy back into the plant rather than that plant trying to make seeds. On perennials and annuals, it's good to be deadheading them, taking off the spent flowers and letting them put their energy back into producing more flowers rather than seed again. You could go ahead and things like your annual baskets, flowering baskets and flowering containers, things that are starting to be water hogs. You'll notice, early in the season when you plant new containers or new hanging baskets, you don't have to do quite as much watering on them. Sometimes by July, it can really become, just more and more and more water. Those things can be cut back a little bit. Just give them a trim, around the edge. Things like petunias are a good example of that. A little midsummer, cut back on them or a haircut on them will reduce their water usage. It'll also kick in some new growth and give you some additional flowers during the rest of the season. I don't fertilize those things, but by midsummer, if you put your flowering things in containers and baskets, March or April, depending on where you were, by midsummer it probably is time to give those things another application of fertilizer, those heavy flowering things. One other reason you might want to cut back your flowering annuals this time of year is they can just kind of stretch on you and then look bad at the bottom. You can go through and cut, maybe a third off the top of things like zinnias, cosmos, things like that you can even perennial salvia or annual salvia. Those things can be cut back and will rejuvenate them, get some new growth down at the bottom, and also increase the number of flowers you have later in the summer. Another thing you might want to walk around your yard and look for are suckers growing from the base of your plants. Things like crepe myrtles, maybe if they got cut back this past winter, they'll start suckering from the base. Any trees that are in your yard, fruit plants as well, for fruit trees, make sure there's just not suckering happening down near the base of the plants. Get those things cut back pretty quickly. It's just taking energy from the top of the plant. One last thing on pruning, your fall blooming perennials, things like mums and asters and sedum, you can prune those back right here until about the middle of July, and that was the cutoff, and that will make them smaller and more compact when they come into flower this coming fall. In the June video, I talked about June being a time when you can kind of lose control of your landscape. Weeds can just go crazy. Shrubs can grow super, super fast that time of year. That can carry over right into July if you're still getting adequate rainfall. So staying on top of weeds is extremely important. Perennial weeds like wiregrass or Bermuda, those things can really, really take off. You want to definitely be in control. Try to be in control of things like violets, which can spread very rapidly from one year to the next, and just being on top of those annual weeds like crabgrass would be a great example of that. If they're in your beds, you don't want to let them come to seed because it's just going to be even a bigger problem that following year. Mulch goes a long way in helping control those weeds. And mulch in the summer is just as important as mulch in the winter. Mulch does a great job of regulating, does a great job of weed control, but also can help keep roots cooler in the summer, just like it can help them stay warmer in the winter. And so if you've gotten down to bare dirt in your beds, it might be a good idea to apply some mulch this time of year. Be super careful if you get a load of mulch this time of year. Sometimes it can come off the mulch yard and have been composting because it's so hot right now, and that mulch can actually burn your plants. So be careful that pile of mulch that's sitting on your driveway, if you can't comfortably stick your hand into it without it hurting, without it being really, really hot, be super careful. You may want to take your wheelbarrow, fill your wheelbarrows, go dump them in the yard, let them cool off a little bit, and then spread them under the base of your plants. I have learned the hard way about putting out composting mulch on plants in the middle of the summer. It's not a great idea, but the mulch is a good idea. And after you apply it, water it in just a little bit. Make sure you cool it off and settle it in around your plants, weeding first before you do that. And that kind of moves me over to watering. Watering in July is obviously going to be important. This is the time of year where your plants can really suffer very quickly from a lack of water, or some of you live in parts of the country where you just don't get very much rain at all in July, or wouldn't get any rain in July, so you're in charge of the watering 100%. I am putting in drip irrigation in this new space that I moved into last year during the month of July. There'll be videos for it, so if you want to follow along with how I'm putting in drip irrigation, welcome, and I hope you do follow those videos. I have some older videos on my channel that are really cover the basics of the parts and pieces of drip irrigation. I'm going to be irrigating my containers, all of the shrubs and trees and perennials, and the vegetable garden over here will be included in those videos. Really, the main thing with watering in July that we have to know is, especially toward the end of July, plants can actually go into a bit of a dormancy in the summer, even though they're not losing their leaves like they would in their winter dormancy, or changing colors or anything like that. They can just kind of go into a stasis where they just kind of sit there and they're not doing anything. Be careful not to overwater when we get to that period of time in the summer. Make sure you're checking the soil before you're watering. Don't just water because it's super hot outside. Some plants can wilt a little bit in the afternoon and then spring right back in the evening. And if that's happening, that may be a plant that you just leave alone. Again, check the soil, dig down a few inches around the base of the plants, make sure they actually need water. When you water in July, water very thoroughly, and then don't water again until you've checked that it has actually become dry again. Some plants you just have, they put on so much growth during the spring, they don't have the capacity to actually bring enough water up to the top for that foliage that they brought up. As long as it's not some sort of flowering shrub or something, if it's just like an evergreen leafy shrub, you can do a little bit of tip pruning on those things just to slow the growth down just a little bit. If you find that they're wilting, but they have adequate moisture in the soil. Obviously containers and baskets and those kinds of things, you're probably going to be watering near daily, or having to check for sure at this point. The things that are in them have been in there long enough that they're rooted into the containers. Almost daily watering is definitely going to be on the table for the rest of the summer for those things that are contained. So what time of day is best to water? I think early morning or in the evening, either one are fine. If you're getting home from work and you're watering at that time of day, try to get the water down to the base of the plants and not spray the tops of them down. Having them wet all night long like that can increase disease issues. There's going to be dew on them probably by the morning, but let's don't send them into the night with the foliage wet like that. Watering in the middle of the day is just going to be a lot of evaporation that time of day. Same thing with your lawn. You want to water in the early morning for sure on your lawn. I don't want to go overnight. As little as possible. Having water right down to the bottom of your grass blades could increase disease issues. I do mow a little higher during the summertime, and that shades the ground a little bit and lessens the amount of water that the turf would need. Turf typically needs about 1 inch of water a week, so you come up with some way to measure that and you know, put a pan out or something like that if you have in-ground irrigation, or if you're you know, moving a sprinkler around the yard, put a pan out and try to put an inch a week out, maybe a ½ inch twice a week. So a couple other things that can get out of control in July. One is vines, for sure. A lot of your vining plants can really take off, and that can be true in the vegetable garden with things like beans and tomatoes, and then it can be true of your flowering vines that you bought, even annual vines, like something like mandevilla. If you're not in Florida and you're trying to grow it as an annual, they can really take off. And you know, at least once a week I would go out and make sure you're winding them around things or cutting back pieces that you don't want on them. That kind of thing. And the other thing, if you're in the South, with our creeping turfs like Bermuda and zoysia and centipede and St. Aug, those can creep into your beds really quickly. So maintaining those bed edges in July is very important, because if once it gets up in your annuals and perennials, it's super hard to get that, you know, to regain that control. So you know, when you're mowing, make sure you're keeping an eye on those creeping turfs. So a few summer planting things that can be done. Number one, we can still do warm season turf at this point. I'm actually going to be sodding here where I'm standing, and a space in the front yard here. If you're following my channel, you can see the sodding videos that I'll be doing here. That's for warm season grasses, things like Bermuda and zoysia and centipede and St. Aug. If you're planting shrubs, and I will continue to plant shrubs and trees right through the rest of the summer, it doesn't bother me at all. I do have a video on my channel about my number one summer pruning, summer planting tip, and it's just prune them a little bit when you plant them. If you take off some of that new growth on shrubs, it helps in transitioning them into the ground during the heat of the summer. Just you're doing enough root damage when you plant something that they can't supply water to the top. Another thing that can be done right now is your spring blooming perennials, your perennials that bloom super early in the season, things like Shasta daisies and irises, that kind of thing. Those can actually be dug up and divided now. That's kind of easy to find them while they still have that foliage on them, but that's totally fine to do now. Cut them back a little bit when you divide them, for the same reason that I said on the shrubs, just to reduce the amount of water it's using. But irises transplant readily this time of year, just divided and cut back a little bit. We can also think about doing a second round of seed for our annuals, things like zinnias and cosmos. It would be easy to start seed on those again and have another round of them blooming right into the fall. Also, your fall blooming annuals, things like pansies and dianthus and snapdragons, if you were going to do those from seed, now would be the time to start seed on those things if you can find them. I consider the last couple weeks of June and the first 2 or 3 weeks of July as the best time of year to do plant propagation. So if you're interested in doing additional perennials and shrubs and trees and things that you already have in your yard or a neighbor has or that kind of thing, this is the time of year to be taking those cuttings. I'm in the process of setting up my mist propagation here at this new place, and there'll be videos during the month of July on propagation if you want to follow along with those. So let's move over and start talking about the vegetable garden. I just harvested potatoes. There's a video coming on that process. I actually did them in grow bags above the ground. Another thing I've got going on is my lettuce is in the process of coming to seed right now, so I'm collecting the seed on that, and it'll be time to remove those. Toward the end of the month of July, you can go ahead and start seeding some of those fall vegetables if you're doing them in the house. You know, things like spinach and lettuce and cauliflower and broccoli and all those things. Sometimes toward the end of July, you'll start to see that on my channel. I'll make a move toward preparing those fall vegetable plants, you know, to put in as my summer garden starts to decline later. The things that are in the, you know, tomatoes are going absolutely crazy this time of year. Cucumbers, all the climbing, especially the climbing vegetables. You know, I've got green beans climbing, I've got cucumbers climbing, I've got tomatoes climbing. It's best to just stay on top of those, make sure you're, you know, have them well staked. As they fruit, they'll fruit from the bottom up, you know, to the top of the plant. As I take off the fruit on the lowest part of the plant, on something like tomatoes, I'm actually taking the foliage off as I go to increase the air movement through the bottom of those plants. Right now, the plants are, you know, just starting to get tomatoes now. So there's a lot of foliage down toward the bottom of the plants, and that is not a great thing for air movement, especially as the plants get taller and taller and taller. It can trap some moisture in the bottom. So I am, like I say, as I harvest, I'm cleaning the leaves up as well, up the plant during the summer. That'll be the same on cucumbers as well as they continue to climb. You can do succession planting in July here. I'm still planting some things. I got some zucchini seed yesterday, and adding that. I'm still pulling out some of my cool season things, and so that's creating some space for additional plants to go in. I just planted some additional tomatoes and peppers down the driveway, so they're about a month and a half behind my other ones, and so I have succession plantings. So these plants will slow down at some point. These, the older plants, and the newer, younger plants tend to grow through a little more of that summer heat somehow and continue to produce. And that's one thing you'll see when it gets really, really hot. You might think your vegetable garden is in decline because they slow down quite a bit. And if you'll just keep watering them through that heat, maybe apply additional round of fertilizer, midsummer, mid-July. Mid-July for sure, I'll go through and fertilize my vegetable garden again, because they're heavy feeders, and we're asking a lot of those types of plants. But as they'll go through a slowdown in the heat of the summer, and if you'll be patient through that slowdown, continue to prune the suckers out, continue to maintain them, continue to water them again, fertilize them again, you'll see as it starts to cool, as the nights start to cool off again in the late summer, a lot of times they'll put on a second burst and give you some additional fruit and vegetables late in the season. So I mentioned refertilizing and watering. Be careful on tomatoes to not push them too hard. This is a time of year as they're maturing that you can crack them if you're pushing the plants too hard. And last year I had a lot of cracked tomatoes. Thus far this year I haven't had any, and I've got just good, slow and steady growth on them is important. Make sure you're picking vegetables regularly during the season. If you allow things like cucumbers to get gigantic, that plant will think it has set seed, and it will definitely slow down production. So in order to keep them blooming and keep them growing all season, make sure you're not letting them think that they set seed. Check under the leaves of things like zucchini and squash, things with larger leaves on them, and see if there's any hidden insect eggs underneath the leaves, because those could be potential problems later in the season. You can just scrape them off pretty easily. Another thing to be on the lookout for right now is your herbs trying to flower, because some of them, especially like basil, if it tries to, once it starts flowering, it will definitely decrease the amount of new leaves you're getting on them. So pinch off those flowers as they're trying to happen all summer long. So let's go through a few miscellaneous things before I wrap up the July to-do video. Number one is mosquitoes. This is super important to be dumping out water, any standing water that's in your yard. If you have a bird bath, make sure you're dumping it out occasionally and replacing that water in it. If you have standing water for some particular reason, you can use those mosquito dunk things in the water. A bat house might be something to consider that would be helpful. It's also entertaining in the evening to watch them do their thing. Another thing I'm going to be doing in the month of July is, or sometime during the summer here, is I'm adding a compost bin here back along the back of the property. And so I'll show you that process. This might be a good time of year to do that, especially if you were cleaning up a lot of things right now. It might be material that you could start your compost bin off with. So another thing to think about during the lazy days of summer is getting out a pen and paper and writing down your successes and failures, from the spring, so that you don't repeat those same things every year. You might want to make a map of your vegetable garden, and so that next year you can move the tomatoes to another space and you can move the peppers to another space, so you're not repeating the same items in the same spaces every year, because pests do tend, once they find them, it's pretty easy for them to find them every single year. So moving those things around is a good idea. July can be the peak time of year for annoying pests on your plants, things chewing on your plants and causing damage. But keep in mind, it's also going to be the peak time of year for beneficial insects, the things that can eat those things that you don't want in the garden. It's also the peak time of year for pollinators like bees and more butterflies during the summer. And so if you do any spraying in your yard, be super selective and be careful with the time of day that you're spraying. I spray nothing in this yard. I let the war happen, and I assume that the beneficials will come in and take care of a lot of those problems. If it's an insect problem that's just happened repeatedly over and over again on the same plant, and it just annoys me to the point where I'd want to actually get something out to spray. Sometimes I think it's just it's a silly battle, and the plant can just be taken out of the landscape, and something else can be added there that would be less likely to be under attack. So I talked about writing down all your successes and failures from the spring. Another thing to be working on right now is your fall planning. So if you're going to have a fall vegetable garden, I talked about starting seed toward the end of the month, and any of your other fall planting plans, things you might want to move around and transplant later in the year. This wouldn't be a great time of year to do it, but certainly as things go dormant in the fall, just having those plans in place. Plans are just a good idea. Great time of year to go and visit gardens near you, paying attention to what's in your neighbors' yards as you're walking around, and then botanical gardens and other gardens in your area and in your state, especially things that are more local to you. If you see things that are super successful, within a mile or two of where you are, likely you could have successes with those same things. And so paying attention to those things, taking photos of them, and writing them down and documenting them. Sometimes you can take a leaf off of something and get it identified. There are apps now for your phone that you can download, and they're pretty good at IDing most things in the landscape, which will again help you with your planning coming up in the fall. So thank you very much for following along with these monthly gardening to-do videos. I will be back in August with the August to-do video. Thanks for watching.